4 centuries ago, the Banda Islands did not know they were famous. They were just small volcanic dots in a vast ocean, places where the sea was calm in the morning and cruel by night, where nutmeg trees grew naturally like grass and the air always carried a warm, sweet smell. The people who lived there believed the land was alive, that the trees listened, that the sea remembered names. Nutmeg was not treasure to them. It was food, medicine, tradition. Children played under those trees. Elders died beneath them. No one imagined that far away. Across oceans they would never cross. Men were already killing each other for what grew quietly in their soil. In Europe, death was everywhere. Plague moved through cities like a shadow that never slept. People believed nutmeg could protect them, cure them, save them. A pinch of it was said to keep death away. A sack of it was worth more than gold. And slowly, the truth became clear to merchants and kings alike. Almost all of this spice came from one place, the Banda Islands, a handful of islands now worth more than entire countries. When the first European ships appeared on the horizon, the Bandanese welcomed them. Trade was normal. Sailors came, exchanged goods, left. No flags planted, no laws imposed. The islands belonged to no empire, only to those who lived and died there. The Bandanese sold nutmeg to anyone willing to trade fairly. To them, this was balance. To Europe, this was a mistake that would cost them everything. The English came first, cautious but hungry. Then came the Dutch, organized, armed, and ruthless. The Dutch East India Company was not just a trading group. It was a state with ships, soldiers, and permission to kill. To them, trade without control was chaos. If the Bandanese sold nutmeg to everyone, then no one could dominate the market. And domination was the goal. Monopoly was the dream. Human life was an obstacle. At first, the Dutch demanded exclusive contracts. The Bandanese refused. They did not understand why selling to one buyer only was necessary. The nutmeg trees did not belong to the Dutch. They belonged to the islands. Refusal turned into tension. Tension turned into threats. And threats turned into plans made far away, in rooms where the Banda Islands existed only as marks on a map. In 1621, Dutch ships returned, not as traders, but as executioners. Soldiers stepped onto the islands carrying muskets, orders, and certainty. The Bandanese were accused of betrayal, of treason, of crimes they didn't even understand. Leaders were captured. They were tortured until confessions were forced from their mouths. Public executions followed. Heads were cut off and displayed as warnings. Villages burned. The screams of families mixed with the sound of the sea. Those who tried to flee were hunted. Those who surrendered were enslaved. Those who resisted were erased. Entire communities disappeared in weeks. Children starved when their parents were killed. Women were taken, sold, or left to die. The nutmeg trees watched silently as the soil beneath them darkened. By the time the killing slowed, nearly an entire people were gone. Out of tens of thousands, only a few hundred survived. The islands were suddenly quiet. Too quiet. But the Dutch did not see emptiness. They saw opportunity. The nutmeg trees still stood, heavy with fruit. So slaves were brought in from distant lands, forced to work plantations guarded by violence. Each tree was counted, each harvest recorded. Human lives were cheaper than spice. The islands became machines, producing wealth for people who would never set foot on the soil soaked with blood. Far away, nutmeg spread across Europe. It flavored food. It sat on shelves. It was celebrated. No one spoke of the people who once lived where it grew. The Banda Islands became rich for others and silent for themselves, and the world moved on, believing the story was finished. But the islands remembered. The wind still moved through the trees the same way it had centuries before. The sea still carried echoes at night. And beneath the plantations, Beneath the villages rebuilt on top of graves, the past waited. Because when something is taken at the cost of an entire people, it does not disappear. It settles, it lingers, and it watches the future grow from its bones. The silence that followed the massacre was not peace. It was the kind of silence that comes after screaming has exhausted itself, when even grief is too weak to make a sound. The Banda Islands looked the same to the sky and the sea, but everything beneath had changed. Paths once worn by generations disappeared. Names were no longer spoken. Songs that had carried history for centuries ended in unfinished notes. The Dutch called this order. They called it success. They counted trees, measured harvests, calculated profit. They did not count the dead because the dead no longer mattered. The survivors lived like ghosts among familiar hills that no longer belonged to them. They were forced to work under men who did not know their language and did not care to learn it. Nutmeg trees were suddenly guarded as if they were kings, while human beings were treated as tools that could be replaced when broken. Every morning began with fear. Every night ended with exhaustion. And still the trees kept growing, indifferent to the suffering beneath their shade. Ships arrived regularly now, heavy with weapons when they came, and heavy with spice when they left. Each shipment carried the scent of nutmeg across oceans, and with it traveled a lie. The lie that this wealth was earned. The lie that this land was empty before it was taken. In Europe, merchants smiled as they opened crates, unaware or unwilling to know that each nutmeg seed had passed through hands that trembled from hunger and pain. The English did not disappear quietly. They hovered at the edges of the islands, watching, waiting, unable to challenge Dutch power directly, but unwilling to forget what they had lost. Letters crossed oceans. Deals were whispered. Wars elsewhere shifted borders and alliances. And far from Banda, men argued over islands they had never seen. To them, Banda was not a home or a grave. It was leverage. Years passed. Children born into slavery grew into adults who knew no other life. They learned to climb trees not for joy, but for survival. They learned that silence was safer than speaking. They learned that the ground they walked on had once been alive with laughter they would never hear. Sometimes elders told fragments of stories in hushed voices, afraid that memory itself might be punished. Even remembering became dangerous. The Dutch system was efficient, and efficiency hid cruelty well. Plantations were numbered. Output was tracked. Punishments were routine. Executions became rare not because mercy had grown, but because fear had done its job. The Banda Islands became an engine that never slept, producing wealth while erasing the evidence of how that wealth was born. Far away, something strange happened. In negotiations meant to end wars between European powers, land was exchanged like currency. The Dutch offered a small island they barely valued. The English accepted, thinking it insignificant at the time. That island was Manhattan, a place that would one day become one of the most powerful cities on Earth was traded for control over nutmeg. History would later pretend this was irony. The truth was simpler. At that moment, spice mattered more than the future. Back in Banda, the land did not forget the trade. The soil had learned the weight of chains and the sound of boots. Fishermen spoke of nights when the sea felt restless, when waves struck the shore without wind. Farmers said some nutmeg trees produced fruit heavier than others, darker, bitterer, as if fed by something deeper than roots. These were dismissed as superstition, but superstition often grows where truth is buried. Generations passed and empires shifted. The monopoly eventually broke. Nutmeg trees were smuggled out, planted elsewhere. The Banda Islands lost their unique power, and with it, the attention of the world. The Dutch left behind ruins and records. They left behind silence. The world moved on to new resources, new obsessions, new reasons to kill. But the islands remained. Quiet, beautiful, scarred. Tourists would one day arrive, drawn by beaches and history books that spoke gently of colonial trade. They walked on paths, built over graves. They tasted nutmeg-flavored dishes without knowing whose lives had flavored them first. Guides spoke of dates and treaties, careful not to linger on screams. And sometimes late at night, when the wind moves just right through the trees, locals say the air grows heavy, not with spice, but with something older, something watching, as if the islands are waiting for someone to finally listen, as if the story is not finished, only paused, stretched across centuries, refusing to fade quietly the way the world expects it to. Time has a strange way of smoothing over violence without ever truly erasing it. On the Banda Islands, decades passed, then a century, and the scars faded just enough to become invisible to outsiders. New houses were built where old ones had burned. Children were born who never knew the original language of the land. Only fragments passed down like forbidden prayers. The nutmeg trees still stood, older than any living person, their branches heavy, their roots deep, reaching into soil that had learned how to keep secrets. The Dutch presence slowly thinned, not because guilt had arrived, but because attention had shifted. The world discovered new obsessions, new lands, new commodities. Banda was no longer the center of everything. It became a background place, mentioned less, visited rarely, remembered poorly. This forgetting felt like mercy to those who benefited from it. For the islands, it felt like a second kind of death. Those who remained learned to live with layers of silence. Silence about who they were before. Silence about what had been taken. Silence about why certain places felt heavy. Why some beaches were avoided after sunset. Why elders lowered their voices when the wind picked up. Memory survived not as stories, but as habits, as warnings without explanations, as fear passed from parent to child without a name. Occasionally someone would dig too deep. A foundation for a new building would uncover bones, too many bones, mixed together, old, fragile, unmistakably human. These discoveries were reported, documented, then covered again. Progress demanded that the past stay buried. It was easier to label it history than to admit it was unfinished. The nutmeg trade continued, but its magic faded. In Europe, nutmeg became ordinary, cheap, something kept in kitchens instead of locked chests. The spice that had once justified mass murder became background flavor. The world did not pause to ask what it had cost. The Banda Islands slipped further into obscurity, as if they had done something wrong by surviving at all. Yet survival has its own memory. The land remembered patterns. Storms seemed to arrive suddenly, without warning. The sea sometimes swallowed boats whole, leaving no wreckage behind. Fishermen spoke of hearing voices carried on the wind. Not words they understood, but tones filled with grief and anger. These stories never made it into official records. They lived where truth often does, between disbelief and fear. Centuries after the massacre, scholars began to look again. Old letters were reread, company records re-examined. Numbers that once seemed like accounting details were recognized for what they were: evidence of extermination. The word genocide began to appear, carefully, reluctantly, as if even naming it might disturb something sleeping beneath the islands. But acknowledgement came without consequences. Apologies were abstract. Responsibility dissolved into time. The descendants of those who ordered the killings lived comfortable lives, far removed from the soil that had paid for their wealth. History books adjusted their language, softened their tone, and moved on. On the islands, life continued. Children laughed. Markets bustled. Boats came and went. From a distance, Banda looked peaceful. From close enough, it felt fragile, as if the ground itself might crack open if pressed too hard. Some nights the air grew thick, and people swore they could smell nutmeg stronger than ever, overwhelming, almost suffocating, as if the trees were reminding the world of what they had witnessed. There are places on Earth where tragedy passes through and leaves, and there are places where it stays, woven into the landscape. The Banda Islands belong to the second kind. Their beauty is real, but it is layered over loss so complete that even language struggles to hold it. What was taken cannot be returned. What was erased cannot be restored. All that remains is presence, a quiet, persistent reminder that the world once decided a spice was worth more than an entire people. And somewhere beneath the roots of the nutmeg trees, beneath the paths and homes and shallow graves, the past waits, not for revenge, not for justice, just to be remembered fully, without comfort, without excuses. Because forgetting was always the final victory of those who came with ships and left with everything. As the 20th century arrived, the Banda Islands entered a new kind of invisibility. Empires collapsed, flags changed, and new nations were born. Yet Banda remained distant from the world's attention, like a witness no one wanted to interview. Modern history rushed forward, loud and crowded, while the islands stayed quiet, carrying memories that no longer fit into the language of progress. Roads were built, radios arrived, and later televisions flickered to life. But none of these things explained the heaviness that still lived in the land. Old people noticed it most. They spoke of a difference between ordinary silence and the silence of certain places. Some nutmeg groves felt wrong after dusk. Some stretches of shore were avoided without discussion. Children were warned not to play near old wells, not because they were dangerous, but because they were full of what was never explained. Questions were met with looks that said some knowledge was not meant to be carried too early. The world beyond the islands learned to tell the story in cleaner ways. Textbooks mentioned trade disputes, company rule, unfortunate conflicts. Dates were listed. Numbers were rounded. The human details dissolved into statistics. What could not be denied was minimized. What could not be minimized was buried under phrases like common for the time. Violence became context. Suffering became background. On Banda, context was not abstract. It lived in faces. Some families could trace their ancestry back to slaves brought from faraway places. Others to the few Bandanese who survived by hiding, fleeing, or submitting. Identity became complicated, layered, fractured. People belonged to the islands, but the islands no longer fully belonged to anyone. Ownership had broken something that could not be repaired. Occasionally outsiders arrived with curiosity instead of indifference. Historians, journalists, researchers, they asked careful questions and took careful notes. They photographed ruins and copied documents. Some listened closely. Others listened only enough to confirm what they already believed. When they left, they took stories with them, but they left the weight behind. The islands kept that. There were moments when the past surfaced without invitation. A storm once uncovered an old burial ground. Bones scattered across the beach like driftwood. For days the sea refused to calm. Another time an earthquake cracked open a hillside, revealing remnants of fortifications built to control plantations long abandoned. Each time there was a brief ripple of attention, followed by silence. The world is skilled at looking away once it has looked just long enough. For the people living there, the question was never whether the past mattered. It was how to live with it without being consumed. Some chose to forget actively, to focus on work, family, the future. Others held on to fragments. Stories told late at night, half-remembered names, warnings passed down without explanation. Memory became a private act, not a public one. Nutmeg trees still dominated the landscape, though their power was symbolic now. They were no longer guarded by soldiers or counted like gold. They stood as ordinary trees, yet they carried an extraordinary history in their rings. Each year of growth marked not just time, but survival. They had watched people arrive with open hands and leave with bloody ones. They had witnessed a transformation so complete that it reshaped the meaning of the land itself. There is a cruelty in how easily the world forgives itself. Time passes, and with it, responsibility fades. The Banda Islands did not receive justice, only distance. No monument large enough to match the loss. No global reckoning, just quiet acknowledgments tucked into footnotes. And still the islands endured, not because endurance was chosen, but because disappearance was not complete. Sometimes at night, when the power cuts out and the stars return to the sky, the islands feel closer to what they once were. The air grows still. The sound of waves becomes steady, almost rhythmic. In those moments, people say it feels as if the land is breathing, slow and heavy, like something asleep but not at rest, as if it remembers every step that ever crossed it. History often asks what was gained: profit, power, control. It rarely asks what remains after those things lose their value. On the Banda Islands, what remains is presence, a sense that the past is not behind but beneath, that it supports the present like soil supports roots, unseen but essential, and that as long as nutmeg trees continue to grow there, the story will never be finished, only continued in quieter ways, waiting for someone to tell it without turning away. The 21st century brought connection to the Banda Islands, but connection did not bring understanding. Mobile phones lit up nights that had once belonged only to stars, and boats arrived faster, louder, carrying visitors who wanted beauty without weight. Photos were taken. Stories were shortened. The islands were framed as paradise, and paradise is easier to sell when it has no memory. The past was still there, but it learned how to hide in plain sight. Young people grew up hearing fragments, never full truths. They knew something terrible had happened, but not how to hold it. Schools taught dates and names, but not the feeling of watching an entire people disappear. Elders hesitated to speak because when they did, they saw fear in young eyes and exhaustion in their own. Trauma had become inherited, passed down without ceremony, shaping instincts rather than beliefs. Sometimes outsiders tried to explain Banda back to itself. They arrived with theories, documentaries, timelines. They spoke of global trade, imperial ambition, economic systems. All of it was true, and all of it missed something essential. It missed the quiet horror of ordinary days turning into final ones. It missed the sound of a village waking up to soldiers. It missed the way fear changes the shape of time. The land carried those details even when people did not. Farmers noticed that certain plots resisted cultivation, no matter how carefully they were tended. Fishers avoided specific waters where nets came back tangled and torn. There were no signs posted, no official warnings. Knowledge moved wordlessly like instinct, like memory embedded too deeply to be spoken. Nutmeg continued to grow, its smell unchanged, sweet and warm, almost comforting. That familiarity was part of the cruelty. The same scent that once signaled home had also signaled doom. It had drawn ships across oceans and soldiers across villages. It had justified contracts and executions. Now it drifted through kitchens and markets, stripped of its history, used without thought. The world's ability to consume without remembering was complete. There were moments when the past forced itself forward. An old journal surfaced in a private collection overseas, detailing orders given and carried out with chilling calm. A museum exhibit briefly acknowledged the scale of the killings before. Attention shifted to something easier to digest. Each revelation landed softly, absorbed without consequence. The dead remained dead. The living were expected to move on. Yet moving on was never simple. Identity on the islands remained layered, tangled with loss and adaptation. People belonged to Banda, but Banda belonged to a history that had never been resolved. Pride and grief existed side by side. Survival itself became a complicated inheritance. To live was to continue something that others had tried to erase. At night, when conversations grew quiet and the sea took over the soundscape, some felt the closeness of what had been, not as ghosts, not as apparitions, but as pressure, a sense that the present rested on something fragile. That comfort had been purchased long ago, and the price was still unpaid. The world prefers endings. It prefers stories that close neatly, tragedies that stay in the past. Banda refused that structure. Its story did not end with treaties or economic shifts. It continued in habits and silences, in the way people lowered their voices without knowing why. It continued in the nutmeg trees, still rooted where lives had once been cut short, still producing fruit as if nothing had happened. There is a particular kind of violence in being forgotten correctly, not denied, not erased entirely, but remembered in ways that remove responsibility. The Banda Islands suffered that violence quietly. They became an example without being a warning, a lesson without a conclusion, and yet the story persisted. It waited in archives, in soil, in the air itself. It waited in the knowledge that something once went terribly wrong, and that its consequences did not vanish when the world's attention moved elsewhere. The islands endured not as a symbol of the past, but as proof that the past can remain present for centuries, shaping lives long after the last ship sails away. Somewhere between the sea and the trees, between what is spoken and what is avoided, the Banda Islands continue to exist as they always have. Beautiful, scarred, alive, holding. A story that refuses to be reduced, waiting for someone to sit with it long enough to feel its weight, and to understand that what was done there is not finished simply because time has passed.